You're standing on a muddy battlefield, arrows whistling overhead, the thunderous crash of steel on steel echoing all around you. A massive knight in gleaming plate armor charges straight at you, sword raised high. You swing your weapon with all your might, connecting squarely with his chest. And then, to your absolute horror, your blade simply bounces off like you just hit a brick wall. The knight doesn't even flinch. Welcome to the brutal reality of medieval warfare, where armor wasn't just some fancy costume for rich nobles to show off in. It was the difference between going home to your family or becoming fertilizer for the battlefield. So you think you know everything about medieval armor? Well, hold on to your helmets, because we're about to shatter every Hollywood myth you've ever believed. From the crushing weight that supposedly made knights helpless turtles, to the idea that any peasant with a pointy stick could take down an armoured warrior. It's time to discover what armour really did on the medieval battlefield. And trust me, the truth is far more incredible than any movie could ever show you. Most people today look at a suit of medieval plate armour and see nothing more than an expensive piece of metal jewellery. Something knights wore to look intimidating or to show off their wealth at fancy tournaments. But that's like saying a modern tank is just for parades. Medieval armour was a technological marvel, a masterpiece of engineering that took centuries to perfect. It was the ultimate survival tool in an age where your life depended on how well you could stop a sword from splitting your skull in half. Let's start with the most important thing armour actually did: protection. Real, honest-to-goodness, life-saving protection that was so effective. It literally changed the entire nature of warfare for nearly 1,000 years. When we talk about medieval armor being protective, we're not talking about reducing damage slightly or giving you a fighting chance. We're talking about making a knight essentially immune to the most common weapons of the day. A well-made suit of plate armor could turn a deadly sword strike into nothing more than a gentle tap. Arrows that could punch through wooden shields would simply bounce off like rubber balls. Spear thrusts that could skewer an unarmored man would slide harmlessly to the side. The secret wasn't just thick metal, though that certainly helped. Medieval armorers were master craftsmen who understood metallurgy, physics, and human anatomy in ways that would impress modern engineers. They created armor using multiple layers of specially treated steel, each piece carefully shaped and positioned to deflect incoming attacks rather than absorb them directly. The curved surfaces of a breastplate weren't just for looks. They were designed to redirect the force of a blow away from the wearer's body. A sword striking the chest of a properly armoured knight wouldn't just hit a flat piece of metal and stop. It would glance off at an angle, sending the weapon sliding harmlessly away. But here's where it gets really interesting. Medieval armour was so effective that it forced weapon makers to completely rethink their approach to killing people. When swords became useless against plate armour, warriors started carrying maces and warhammers instead. These weren't crude clubs like you see in movies. They were precision weapons designed specifically to deal with the armour problem. A mace couldn't cut through steel, but it could deliver such devastating blunt force trauma that it would turn the armour itself into a weapon against its wearer. The metal plates that protected a knight from cuts could become the very thing that crushed his ribs when struck with enough force. This led to an arms race that lasted for centuries. Armour got better, so weapons got deadlier. Weapons got deadlier, so armour got more sophisticated. Crossbows were developed that could punch through mail, so armourers created plate armour. Plate armour stopped crossbows, so weapon makers invented specialised armour-piercing bolts. The cycle continued endlessly, driving innovation on both sides. The effectiveness of armour wasn't just theoretical either. We have countless historical accounts of knights walking away from battles that should have killed them 10 times over. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, French knights in high-quality steel armour were peppered with thousands of English arrows, and kept fighting. The arrows simply couldn't penetrate the better quality steel that had become available by the middle of the 14th century. Contemporary chroniclers described how the arrows would strike the French knights and shatter or bounce off, leaving the warriors essentially unharmed from the missile fire that was devastating unarmored troops. Now, this doesn't mean armor made knights invincible. Nothing could guarantee complete protection, and smart enemies found ways around even the best armor. But for the average medieval warrior, facing an opponent in full plate was like a modern soldier trying to fight a tank with a kitchen knife. It wasn't just difficult, it was practically impossible. The psychological impact of armor was almost as important as the physical protection. Imagine being a peasant conscript, barely trained and equipped with nothing but a rusty spear and cloth padding. Suddenly, this gleaming metal giant appears through the smoke of battle, arrows bouncing off him like raindrops, sword cuts doing absolutely nothing. The sheer terror of facing something that seemed immune to your weapons could break an entire army's morale before the real fighting even began. But armor did far more than just keep knights alive. It was a walking advertisement of wealth, power, and social status that could be seen from across a battlefield. In a world where most people owned nothing more valuable than the clothes on their backs, a single suit of armor represented a fortune that could bankrupt entire families. Modern estimates suggest that equipping a medieval knight with high-quality armor could cost the equivalent of anywhere from $500,000 to $3.5 million in today's money. This wasn't just expensive because armor was fancy. It was expensive because it required incredible skill, time, and resources to create. A master armorer might spend months crafting a single breastplate, carefully shaping and tempering the steel to achieve the perfect balance of protection and mobility. Every piece had to be custom fitted to the individual knight's body. There was no such thing as one size fits all when your life depended on how well your armor moved with you. The economic barrier meant that armor created a clear military hierarchy that reinforced the entire feudal system. Knights weren't just better fighters because they trained more. They were better fighters because they could afford equipment that made them nearly unstoppable against common soldiers. This created a self-perpetuating cycle where military success led to wealth, which led to better armor, which led to more military success. Legal requirements in medieval England actually mandated that freemen own certain types of weapons and armor based on their wealth. If you had goods worth 10 marks, you were required to have a mail shirt, helmet, and spear. Poorer freemen needed at least a helmet, spear, and quilted armor called a gambeson. These laws weren't suggestions, they were the medieval equivalent of draft registration, ensuring that society could field an army when needed while maintaining the social order that kept knights at the top of the military food chain. The result was that most medieval armies looked like a pyramid. At the top, you had a small number of heavily armoured knights who were essentially walking fortresses. Below them were men-at-arms with decent but not perfect protection. At the bottom were masses of peasant soldiers wearing whatever scraps of armour they could afford or scavenge, often just a helmet and maybe a leather jerkin. This hierarchy wasn't just about money, though. Armour also served as a form of identification on the battlefield. In the chaos of medieval combat, where friend and foe might be fighting side by side in a confused melee, being able to instantly recognize who was on your side could mean the difference between life and death. The distinctive shapes and decorations of different types of armor helped soldiers identify allies and enemies, even when visibility was poor and adrenaline was running high. But the most fascinating thing about medieval armor wasn't what it could stop. It was how it changed the entire nature of combat itself. When knights started wearing effective plate armor, Warfare transformed from quick, decisive encounters into grinding wars of attrition. Battles that might have lasted an hour with lightly armoured troops could drag on for the entire day when both sides were heavily protected. The Battle of Towton in 1461 went on for 10 brutal hours in a snowstorm, largely because the armoured men-at-arms on both sides were so difficult to kill that neither force could achieve a quick breakthrough. This created an entirely new style of fighting. Instead of trying to cut through armour, warriors developed techniques specifically designed to exploit weak points. Knights learned to thrust sword points into the gaps at joints, under the arms, or through the visor slits of helmets. They carried specialized daggers called rondel daggers that were designed specifically for slipping between armor plates to deliver killing blows. Combat became less about wild swinging and more about precise technical grappling, where opponents would wrestle each other to the ground and then try to find a gap in the armor where they could land a fatal strike. The weight issue that everyone obsesses over today was actually far less problematic than most people imagine. A full suit of plate armor typically weighed between 45 and 55 pounds, which sounds like a lot until you realize that's less than what a modern soldier carries into combat. The key difference was weight distribution. Unlike a backpack that puts all the weight on your shoulders, armor spread the load across your entire body. A properly fitted suit felt more like wearing a heavy winter coat than carrying a massive burden. Medieval knights trained extensively to fight in armor from childhood. They didn't just put on 60 pounds of metal and hope for the best. There are historical accounts of knights performing incredible athletic feats while fully armored. Jean Le Mangre, known as Boucicaut, could supposedly climb walls, perform somersaults, and even run for miles while wearing his full plate armor. These weren't superhuman warriors. They were simply men who had spent their entire lives training to fight in the equipment that kept them alive. The mobility myths come largely from tournament armor, which was intentionally heavier and more restrictive than battlefield gear. Tournament armor was designed for specific competitions where mobility mattered less than maximum protection from the devastating impact of a charging horse and lance. Battle armor was much lighter and more flexible, allowing knights to mount their horses unassisted, fight on foot for hours, and move with surprising agility. But armor's influence went far beyond individual combat. It shaped military tactics, castle design, and even the development of entire technologies. When armor made cavalry charges nearly unstoppable, defenders had to dig deeper ditches and build higher walls. When crossbows became powerful enough to threaten armored knights, castle walls had to be redesigned with thicker stones and better angles to deflect bolts. The rise of gunpowder weapons marked the beginning of the end for armor's dominance, but even then, the transition took centuries. Early firearms were unreliable, slow to reload, and often less effective than a good crossbow. Armor makers initially responded by making their products thicker and more specialized. Pistol-proof armor became common, designed specifically to stop bullets from early handguns. Some breastplates from this period actually have dents in them, where the armorer fired a pistol at the finished product to prove its effectiveness. The social implications of armor's decline were just as dramatic as the military ones. When firearms made expensive armor obsolete, the entire feudal system began to crumble. Common soldiers with muskets could now kill knights just as easily as other peasants. The military advantage that had kept the nobility in power for 1,000 years vanished almost overnight. Professional armies replaced feudal levies, and warfare became more about discipline, training, and technology than individual wealth and status. Medieval armor wasn't just protective gear, it was the foundation of an entire civilization. It determined who held power, how wars were fought, and what weapons were developed. It influenced everything from castle architecture to social customs to legal systems. For nearly a millennium, the ability to afford and effectively use armor was what separated the rulers from the ruled, the living from the dead. The next time you see a suit of medieval armor in a museum, remember that you're not just looking at an expensive costume or a relic from a more primitive time. You're looking at one of the most sophisticated pieces of military technology ever created. A masterwork of engineering that took centuries to perfect and shaped the course of human history. Medieval armor didn't just protect knights from weapons, it protected an entire way of life until gunpowder finally leveled the playing field and ushered in the modern world. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. If you enjoyed learning about what armor really did on the battlefield, make sure to subscribe because we dive deep into medieval history every single week. Until next time, remember that the past was far more incredible and brutal than any movie could ever show you. Cheers.